My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 38 years old. Last month, my parents begged me to save the same brother they had chosen over me for 9 summers in a row. They stood on my porch with tears in their eyes. They said family comes first. I almost laughed. Then I closed the door in their faces. That should have been the end. It was not. 2 days later, a lawyer called and told me there was one document from my late aunt that no one in my family had ever seen. My hands went cold. My parents had always insisted she left me nothing except happy childhood memories. They had repeated that story for years until I believed it myself. They lied. Everything I thought I knew began to fall apart. I kept asking myself the same question. Why did they send me away every single summer from the age of 8 until I turned 17? Why was my brother always smiling in photographs from beaches and amusement parks, while I stood beside my aunt watering tomatoes or helping her paint old fences? Why did my aunt always hug me a little longer every August before I went home? What was she trying to tell me, and why did I never understand? If you enjoy emotional stories about family secrets and finding the courage to stand up for yourself, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Then leave a comment and tell me this. What would you have done in her place? I'm curious to read your thoughts. I thought the worst part of my life had already happened. I was wrong, because when I finally opened the envelope my aunt had hidden for almost a decade, I found one single photograph folded inside. Someone had carefully cut one person out of it, and I instantly recognized the missing silhouette. I used to believe every family had strange traditions. Ours began the summer I turned 8. My parents told me Aunt Margaret was lonely after my uncle passed away. They said she needed company. They said I was such a thoughtful little girl and that I could help her through the hardest season of her life. I remember nodding because I wanted to be good. I remember watching my younger brother Daniel jump around the living room with a brand new suitcase covered in airplane stickers. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Disney World," he shouted. Mom smiled without looking at me. "You and Aunt Margaret will have your own adventure." At 8 years old, I believed her. I packed my favorite book, my stuffed rabbit, and 3 dresses. Dad drove me to my aunt's farmhouse 3 hours away. The road was lined with old oak trees that seemed to stretch forever. When we arrived, Aunt Margaret hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "There you are, sweetheart." She looked at my father with tired eyes. "You could still change your mind." Dad forced a smile. "This is best for everyone." He left less than 5 minutes later. I stood on the porch watching his car disappear until the dust settled. Aunt Margaret never rushed me inside. She simply rested her hand on my shoulder. "You can miss people and still have a good summer," she whispered. That became our ritual. Every June, my parents dropped me off. Every June, Daniel disappeared on another family vacation. Florida, California, Yellowstone, cruises, ski resorts. Every September, our living room filled with framed photographs of smiling faces. Every single one included my brother. Not one included me. When relatives visited, they laughed over stories from roller coasters and beach sunsets. Someone would eventually turn to me. "You had fun with your aunt too, right?" I always smiled. Of course. It became easier than telling the truth, because the truth was complicated. I did love my summers with Aunt Margaret. She taught me how to grow vegetables from seeds. She showed me how to bake bread without measuring cups because she trusted her instincts more than recipes. She let me paint old furniture bright colors even when the neighbors called it ridiculous. She listened, really listened. If I said I wanted to become an architect, she asked why. If I changed my mind a week later, she asked what had inspired me. She never laughed. She never compared me to Daniel. At home, everything somehow became a competition. Daniel was athletic. Daniel was outgoing. Daniel made friends easily. Daniel deserved encouragement because he was special. I was the easy child, the independent one, the one who understood. Those words followed me for years. "You understand, Evelyn. You never ask for much. You know your brother needs this more." I started believing that needing less made me easier to leave behind. When I turned 12, I accidentally found a stack of vacation brochures in the kitchen before summer break. There were 4 airline tickets, not 3, 4. I stared at them until Mom walked into the room. She grabbed the papers so quickly they slipped from her hands. "You weren't supposed to see those. Why are there 4 tickets?" Her face changed for only a second. Your father made a mistake, but there are 4 names. She folded the papers before I could read them. The airline always prints extras. That answer made no sense. I knew it. She knew it. Neither of us said another word. That summer, I asked Aunt Margaret a question I had never asked before. Do my parents actually want me here? She stopped peeling apples. Her knife rested on the cutting board. Then she looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. What makes you ask that? Because Daniel always goes with them. I never do. She reached across the table and took my hand. Sweetheart. There are truths adults tell themselves until they forget their lies. I frowned. I don't understand. One day you will. Her answer stayed with me long after that conversation ended. The older I became, the stranger everything felt. Every birthday, Daniel received expensive gifts. I received practical ones. Every school achievement of mine became family news for a few minutes. Daniel scoring 1 goal during soccer season became dinner conversation for weeks. It hurt. Not because I wanted more presents, because I wanted to matter. The summer I turned 16, something changed. Dad dropped me off as usual. But before leaving, he handed Aunt Margaret a thick envelope. They thought I was inside. I wasn't. I had forgotten my backpack and walked back toward the porch. Their voices drifted through the screen door. Margaret, this has to stay between us. I know what we agreed. Just keep her happy. She deserves better than this. Please, not now. Dad sounded exhausted. Just 1 more year, 1 more summer, then she'll never have to know. My heart started pounding. Know what? I stepped backward before either of them noticed me. For the rest of that summer, Aunt Margaret watched me differently. Sometimes she opened her mouth as if she wanted to confess something. Then she stayed silent. On the last evening before I returned home, she gave me a small silver compass. Keep this safe. Why? Because one day you'll need something that reminds you where your true home is. I laughed awkwardly. This is my home too, she smiled. I hope one day it feels that way. At the time, I thought she was talking about confidence. Now I knew she had meant something entirely different. Because after opening that mysterious envelope from her lawyer, I turned the old photograph over. There was handwriting on the back. Only 6 words. Ask for the summer of 2004. I stared at those 6 words until the ink blurred. Ask for the summer of 2004. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just those words. I checked the date on the photograph again. It had been taken in July of 2004. I was 8 years old. The first summer my parents sent me away. My hands were trembling as I searched through the folder the lawyer had given me. There were tax records, insurance papers, property deeds. Everything looked painfully ordinary. Then I found a sealed envelope. Across the front, in Aunt Margaret's careful handwriting, were 5 words. Only if she asks first. I broke the seal. Inside was a single page. If you are reading this, Evelyn, it means you finally asked the right question. I promised your father I would remain silent while I was alive. It is the greatest regret of my life. I kept that promise because I believed he would eventually tell you the truth himself. Every year I hoped it would happen. Every year he failed you. I stopped reading. My chest tightened. The lawyer quietly slid a box of tissues toward me without saying a word. Take your time, he said. I looked up. Did you know about this? He nodded slowly. Only after your aunt updated her will 3 months before she passed away. She made one request. What request? That you receive the letter only after both the estate was settled and you personally asked about the photograph. Why? Because she believed you had to discover that your memories deserved questioning before you could accept the truth. I looked back at the letter. My aunt's handwriting felt almost alive. The summer of 2004 was never about giving me company. I was lonely, yes, but that was never the reason your parents left you with me. They needed you out of the house while they made a decision that would change your life forever. A cold wave rushed through me. Decision? What decision? I kept reading. Your brother became seriously ill that spring. He recovered completely. Thank God for that. But during those frightening weeks, your parents convinced themselves that every resource, every moment, every dollar, every dream had to belong to him. They began calling him the child they could not lose. Without realizing it, they slowly turned you into the child they believed would always survive without them. Tears rolled onto the paper. That sounded painfully familiar. You understand, Evelyn. You never ask for much. You know your brother needs this more. Those sentences suddenly had a beginning. My aunt continued. The vacation started because your parents believed Daniel deserved joyful memories after his illness. They said they could not afford vacations for everyone. That part was true. What was not true was their choice. They never alternated. They never searched for another solution. They simply decided you would sacrifice every summer because you were easier to disappoint. I covered my mouth. The room was completely silent. The lawyer lowered his eyes. He had probably watched people discover terrible truths before. But this one felt personal. The letter went on. I argued with them every year. I offered to pay for both children. They refused. I offered to stay home while all of you traveled together. They refused. I even offered to take Daniel one summer instead. They refused that too. They said he needed real family time. Those 4 words hit me harder than anything else. Real family. Then what had I been? I remembered every postcard, every souvenir keychain, every family photograph where my place had been quietly erased before the picture was even taken. None of it had happened by accident. It had been policy, a family policy. I turned another page. There was more. One evening during your first summer, I overheard your father telling your mother something I have never forgotten. He said Evelyn won't remember after a few years. Children adjust. He was wrong. Children always remember, even when they pretend they do not. I couldn't breathe. For years I had blamed myself for being sensitive, for noticing, for counting the summers, for wondering why there was never room for me. But I had remembered exactly what they hoped I would forget. The lawyer finally spoke. There is one more item. He opened a small archive box. Inside were neatly organized envelopes, each labeled by year, all the way to 2012. What are these? Letters. From whom? Your aunt. To your parents. None were ever mailed. Why not? Because she wrote them after every summer. She hoped writing would stop her from saying things she could never take back. I opened the first envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Your daughter cried herself to sleep again tonight after pretending she was happy all day. She asked why her brother gets vacations while she gets responsibility. I lied to protect you. I told her life is unfair sometimes. I hate myself for saying it because this is not life. This is your choice. I reached for the next letter, then another. Every summer the words grew sharper, more desperate. Your daughter no longer asks why. She believes she is the answer. My vision blurred again. That sentence broke something inside me, because it was true. By 15 I had stopped asking, stopped expecting, stopped hoping. I simply accepted that I came second, always, until I reached the final envelope. It was dated August 2012, the last summer before I left for college. I unfolded it carefully. This is my final attempt. If you do not tell Evelyn the truth before she becomes an adult, I will. She deserves to know that I begged you for 9 years to stop treating love like something that has to be earned. My heart stopped. Someone had written across the bottom of the page in blue ink, "Not yet." The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to my father. And beneath those 2 words was his signature. My father's signature haunted me more than the words themselves. Not yet. 2 words. 9 years. How many times had he promised himself he would finally tell me the truth next month, next birthday, next Christmas, next summer? Until there were no summers left. I took every letter home with me. For 3 nights, I barely slept. I spread them across my dining table in chronological order. Each one was another piece of my childhood I had never been allowed to see. Patterns began to emerge. The first few letters were full of hope. Margaret believed my parents would come to their senses. By the middle years, her tone became frustrated. By the last 2, she sounded heartbroken. She wasn't only worried about me, she was worried about what my parents were becoming. Then I noticed something strange. Every envelope contained a copy of a receipt. Bank transfers, canceled checks, invoices. At first, they seemed unrelated, until I looked closer. Every June, exactly 1 week before my parents left for vacation, my aunt transferred them money. Sometimes $5,000, sometimes 3, sometimes more. I frowned. Why would she do that? I called the lawyer. Did my aunt ever explain these payments? There was a pause. She said they were temporary loans. Were they ever repaid? No, not a single dollar. My stomach twisted. The vacations, the flights, the resorts, the photographs. My aunt had helped pay for them. I sank into my chair. She had tried to make sure there was enough money for all of us. Instead, they had simply spent more on themselves. I searched through the receipts again. One transfer caught my eye. June 2008. Memo line. For both children. Those 3 words refused to leave my mind. For both children. I requested copies of my aunt's bank records. It took nearly 2 weeks. When they arrived, I spent an entire Saturday reading hundreds of pages. Then I found it. A handwritten note attached to one transfer. If there is not enough after booking, everyone please cancel the trip. No child should be left behind. My hands clenched into fists. My parents had deposited the money 3 days later. 5 days after that. They purchased 3 airline tickets, not 4. The choice had never been forced on them. It had been deliberate. I finally understood why Aunt Margaret had looked at my father with such disappointment every June. She knew, she had always known. I decided it was time to stop wondering. I called my mother. She sounded cheerful. Evelyn, it's been weeks. How are you? I ignored the question. Did Aunt Margaret ever give you money for our vacations? Silence. Mom, where did you hear that? So it's true. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. Your aunt wanted to help. For both children? Another silence. Finally she whispered. Yes. My throat tightened. Then why wasn't I ever there? Honey, it wasn't that simple. I laughed. For the first time in years. Not because anything was funny. Because I had heard those exact words my entire life. It wasn't that simple. You don't understand. One day you'll see. Always another excuse. Never an answer. Mom spoke again. Daniel needed us. I needed you too. You were stronger. No, I interrupted. I looked strong because nobody ever checked whether I was breaking. She started crying. Please don't do this over the phone. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. No, because your father doesn't know I'm talking to you. That sentence made me stop. He doesn't know. He's afraid. Afraid of what? You. I almost smiled. My father had never been afraid of me. He had ignored me, dismissed me, expected forgiveness before asking for it. Now he was afraid. Interesting. Mom lowered her voice. Your father has something he wants to explain. 30 years old wasn't enough time? He's ashamed, I answered quietly. Good. Then I ended the call. An hour later, someone knocked on my door. Not my parents. Daniel. He looked older than I remembered. More tired. There were gray strands in his dark hair. Can I come in? I hesitated. Then stepped aside. He stood awkwardly in my living room. I don't know where to start. Try the truth. He nodded. I knew. Every summer. He looked down. Not at first. When did you find out? I was 14. The room suddenly felt much smaller. You knew for 4 years before I left for college. He nodded again. Why didn't you tell me? His eyes filled with tears. Because every time I asked Mom where you were, she said you preferred staying with Aunt Margaret. When I learned that wasn't true, I tried refusing to go. I stared at him. You what? 3 summers. I refused. Dad screamed at me. Mom cried. They said I was being selfish. They said after everything our family had been through, I owed them happy memories. He swallowed hard. Eventually, they told me if I stayed home, nobody would go anywhere. They blamed me for ruining every vacation before it even started. I felt my anger shift, not disappear. Shift, Daniel continued. I thought if I kept going, maybe next year they'd finally take both of us. Next year never came. I searched his face, for excuses, for lies. Instead, I found guilt. Real guilt. He reached into his backpack. I found these after Mom called today. He handed me a small stack of photographs, vacation pictures. Except, these were different. Every single one had an empty space beside Daniel. Sometimes it was an empty chair, sometimes an extra beach towel, sometimes a fourth place setting at a restaurant. I looked at him. Why did they leave room? His voice broke. Because every year I asked them to. And every year, I hoped they'd change their minds before we left. I couldn't speak. Then he pulled out one final photograph. It had never been developed professionally. Just a faded home print. On the back, my father's handwriting read, "Maybe next summer, all four of us." The date underneath froze the air in the room. June 2013. The summer after I had already moved away forever. The date refused to leave my mind. June 2013. I had already packed my things for college. I had signed the dorm paperwork. I had accepted, quietly and completely, that my place in the family had always been somewhere on the outside. Yet my father had written those words. Maybe next summer, all four of us. Maybe. Not promise, not apology. Just another postponement. I set the photograph on the table. Daniel rubbed his face. I found a box in Dad's attic last week. I wasn't looking for anything. I was helping him clear old files. He reached into his backpack one last time. There was a leather notebook. Small. Worn. The corners had faded from years of being handled. Dad's journal. I looked at him. You read it? I wish I hadn't. He slid it across the table. I opened the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a planner. Appointments, business meetings, mortgage payments, doctor visits. Then, tucked between those ordinary entries, were handwritten reflections. July 18, 2004. Margaret says Evelyn cried again tonight. I hate hearing that. But Daniel laughed for the first time in months today. I have to believe we're making the right choice. I closed my eyes. He had known, every single tear. He had known. Another page, August 2006. Evelyn barely hugged us goodbye. She is becoming so independent. Maybe this is easier for her now, I whispered to myself. No, it was easier for you. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Whenever I became quieter, he interpreted it as healing. Whenever I stopped asking, he assumed I had accepted. He never considered another possibility, that I had simply stopped believing anyone would answer. Then I reached the final entry, September 2013. We lost Evelyn today. Not physically. Something changed. She smiled at dinner. She thanked us for helping her move. She hugged her mother. Then she looked at me like I was a stranger. I think she finally stopped waiting for me to become the father she deserved. My vision blurred. He knew. At least by then. He knew. I closed the journal. Neither Daniel nor I spoke for a long time. Finally, he asked quietly, "Can I tell you something selfish?" I nodded. "I've spent years wishing you hated me." I frowned. "Why?" "Because hating me would have been easier than loving me. Instead, you still remembered my birthday. You sent Christmas gifts for my kids. You came to Emma's dance recital. You never punished me for what they did." His voice cracked. I never deserved that kindness. I reached across the table. "You were a child, too." He lowered his head. "Not after 14. No, not after 14. Neither of us tried to erase his responsibility. He had made mistakes. He admitted them. That mattered. A week later, my parents asked if we could meet. Not at their house, not mine. A quiet cafe halfway between our towns. I almost canceled 3 different times. Instead, I went. Mom looked exhausted. Dad looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just smaller. For several minutes, nobody touched their coffee. Finally, Dad spoke. I read Margaret's letters. I stared at him. When? After her funeral. Why didn't you call me? Because there was nothing I could say that would justify them. He pushed a thick envelope across the table. What's this? Every receipt. Every transfer. Every letter she ever sent us. Including the ones you haven't found. I looked inside. There were dozens more, unopened. He had never even read them. My stomach turned. You didn't open them. He shook his head. I couldn't. I knew what she'd written. I couldn't bear seeing it. So instead, you ignored them. Just like you ignored me. He nodded. Yes. No excuses. Just one word. Yes. For the first time in my life. He answered directly. No explanation, no blame. No but, just truth. He continued quietly. I kept telling myself Daniel needed us more. By the time I realized you needed us just as much, you had already learned not to need us at all. Mom began crying. Every birthday I wanted to tell you, every Christmas, every graduation. Your father always said next week, next month, after vacation, after work slowed down, after Daniel settled into college. There was always another later. Later became 20 years. I listened. Without interrupting, Dad looked directly at me. You asked me once when you were 9 if I loved you the same. Do you remember? Of course I remembered. I had asked while washing dishes. He had smiled. Don't ask silly questions. Now tears filled his eyes. The truthful answer should have been this. I loved you, but I did not protect you equally, and children do not measure love by feelings. They measure it by choices. I had never heard anything more painfully accurate. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was naming the wound. There was a difference. He reached into his jacket pocket. One final item, the silver compass. My breath caught. I thought, Aunt Margaret left it to me. She did. Years before she died, she asked me to return it to you if you ever agreed to meet me after learning the truth. He smiled sadly. She said one day Evelyn will know where home really is. I turned the compass over. There was tiny engraving I had never noticed. Not where you were wanted. Where you were valued. Tears slipped down my face. I finally understood. Aunt Margaret had never tried to replace my parents. She had spent 9 summers trying to keep one little girl from believing she was unworthy of being loved. She had almost succeeded. Not because she erased the pain, because she planted something stronger beside it. Self-worth. I stood. My parents looked frightened. Dad whispered, "Is this goodbye?" I answered honestly, "No. This is the first conversation we've ever actually had. Whether we have another one depends on what happens after today." I hugged my brother before leaving. I nodded politely to my mother. Then I looked at my father. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, he said the words I had unknowingly waited 22 years to hear. I failed you. Not because I loved you less. Because I chose convenience over courage. I'm sorry. This time. He did not ask me to understand. He did not ask me to forgive him. He simply accepted that the apology belonged to me. Months passed, then years. Some relationships healed slowly. Some never became what they should have been. My parents learned that rebuilding trust is much harder than breaking it. Sometimes I visited. Sometimes I declined. For the first time in my life, the choice was mine. Daniel and I became close in ways neither of us expected. My nieces know me as the aunt who never misses birthdays, never misses school plays, never forgets promises. Because I know exactly what forgotten promises cost. The farmhouse eventually became mine. I restored it room by room. The vegetable garden still grows every summer. The old porch swing still creaks in the evening. And the silver compass hangs beside the front door. Not because I need directions, but because every time I leave the house and every time I come home, it reminds me of the greatest lesson Aunt Margaret ever gave me. Family is not measured by who shares your vacations, or your photographs, or even your last name. Family is measured by who makes sure you never spend years wondering whether you deserved a seat at the table. For too long, I believed I had been the child left behind. Now I know the truth. I was never left behind. I was simply led, one quiet summer at a time, toward the only place where I would finally learn my own worth. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. There was only one page, no excuses, no memories rewritten, no attempt to convince me he had always been a good father. Instead, he wrote about the things he was finally doing. He had framed exactly one family photograph in the living room. Not the vacations, not birthdays, not holidays. It was the picture Aunt Margaret had secretly taken during my high school graduation. I had almost forgotten it existed. All 4 of us were standing together, no one smiling perfectly, no one posing, just one ordinary moment. He wrote that he had placed it where every visitor could see it, because he was done pretending our family history had been something it wasn't. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same box that held Aunt Margaret's. Some stories deserved to stay together. A few months later, I invited my parents to the farmhouse for the first time. Not because everything had been repaired, because healing needed somewhere honest to begin. Mom arrived carrying flowers. Dad carried nothing except a toolbox. I looked at him. "What's that for?" He smiled awkwardly. "The porch step still squeaks. I thought maybe I could fix something." It was such a small sentence, yet it said everything. He no longer believed he could repair the past. He simply wanted to repair what stood in front of him. For hours we worked in silence. Mom weeded the garden. Daniel painted the fence with his children. Dad replaced loose boards on the porch. When evening came, we sat together watching the sunset. No expensive resort, no luxury hotel, no matching vacation shirts. Just homemade lemonade, fresh tomatoes from the garden, children laughing across the yard. I caught Dad watching the compass hanging beside the front door. Margaret was right, wasn't she? I smiled. She usually was. He nodded. I thought home was the place we took vacations. She knew it was the place where no one had to earn their place. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Years later, when my oldest niece graduated from high school, she asked if we could spend a week at the farmhouse before college. Just us. We baked bread, picked tomatoes, painted an old wooden bench bright blue. On the last evening, she hugged me. "Aunt Evelyn, thank you for making summers feel safe." I closed my eyes for a moment, because somewhere, in a memory that still ached a little, an 8-year-old girl finally heard the words she had needed all along. "You belong here. You always did. And this time." I believed them. The last time I visited my parents' house, I noticed something that made me stop in the hallway. The wall of vacation photographs was gone. For decades, it had been the first thing anyone saw after walking through the front door. Smiling faces, sunny beaches, perfect memories. Now the wall was empty. Dad noticed me looking. I took them down last month. Why? Because they told an incomplete story. He led me into the living room. There, above the fireplace, hung something entirely different. Pictures from the farmhouse. Daniel teaching his daughter to plant tomatoes. Mom laughing with flour on her face after burning her first loaf of bread. Me sitting on the porch swing with a cup of coffee. No matching clothes. No expensive destinations. No forced smiles. Just ordinary days. The kind we had never known how to value. Dad stood beside me. Those vacations used to remind me of what I thought I'd given my family. Now they remind me of what I took away. I rested a hand on his arm. "You can't change those summers." "I know," he looked at the new photographs. "But I can choose what the next ones look like." That Christmas we celebrated at the farmhouse. The children built snowmen in the yard. Daniel accidentally burned the marshmallows. Mom laughed until she cried. Dad spent half an hour helping my youngest niece repair a broken birdhouse, instead of buying her a new one. Years ago, he would have solved the problem with money. Now he solved it with time. It was a better gift. Late that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside. Snow covered the garden where Aunt Margaret and I had once planted tiny tomato seedlings together. The porch swing creaked softly in the wind. I sat there wrapped in a blanket. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice. Not as a ghost, not as imagination, as memory. She had never promised me life would become fair. She had simply shown me that unfairness did not have to decide who I became. That lesson outlived her. A few weeks later, I received another letter. This one wasn't from my father. It was from my mother. She wrote about every summer she had silently cried after returning from vacation. How she had convinced herself they would make it up to me later. How every year later became harder. She ended the letter with one sentence. "I confused loving you with believing you could survive without me." I folded the page carefully. She was right about one thing. I had survived. But children should never have to survive the people who are supposed to protect them. They should simply be loved. Today, when people ask why I never had children of my own, I smile. Sometimes I tell them life took me in a different direction. Sometimes I tell them I became the aunt every child deserves. Every summer, my nieces and nephews spend a week at the farmhouse. No phones during dinner. Everyone helps in the garden. Everyone chooses one meal to cook. Everyone gets a turn telling a story before bed. No one is left out, not once. On the final evening of every visit, I give each child a tiny compass, Nothing expensive, just a simple silver keepsake. They always ask the same question, why a compass? And I always give them the same answer. Because the most important journey you'll ever take isn't finding a place on a map. It's finding the people who never make you wonder if you belong. Then I watch them run back toward the house, laughing, calling for each other. Never counting who was invited, never wondering who was chosen. And every single time, I silently thank the woman who spent 9 quiet summers teaching one forgotten little girl that love is never measured by who gets the vacation. It's measured by who saves you from believing you were ever less worthy of it. 5 years passed before I realized something unexpected. The pain no longer arrived first. For years, every memory of my childhood had begun with loss. Now it began with Aunt Margaret's garden, with fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, with muddy shoes left by the back door, with laughter echoing across the porch. Healing had quietly rewritten the order of my memories. One spring afternoon, I decided to renovate the old barn behind the farmhouse. It had become little more than a place to store forgotten furniture and dusty boxes. Daniel came to help. So did his teenagers. Halfway through clearing one corner, my niece Emma called out, "Aunt Evelyn, come look at this." Hidden beneath an old canvas sheet stood a weathered wooden chest. Inside were dozens of handmade crafts, birdhouses, painted flower pots, small wooden toys. Each one carried a tiny paper label, "For Evelyn, when she has children." I stopped breathing. Daniel picked up one of the labels. "She made all of these?" I nodded. Over many summers. She always said she liked staying busy. I never knew this was what she meant. At the bottom of the chest lay one final envelope. It wasn't sealed. The paper had faded almost white. If life surprises you and these gifts are never needed, don't be sad. Love never goes to waste. Someone else's child will always need kindness. That evening, we loaded everything into the truck. Over the next year, we restored every birdhouse and every toy. Instead of storing them away again, we donated them to a local children's center. Not anonymously. Each carried a small wooden tag, "Made with Love by Margaret Hayes." One rainy afternoon, the director invited us to visit. Children were painting the same flower pots Aunt Margaret had once made. Tiny hands proudly carried colorful birdhouses into the garden. One little girl hugged hers so tightly that wet paint stained her sweater. Her grandmother apologized. The child looked terrified. Before anyone could speak, I knelt beside her. "It's only paint. Things can be cleaned. Hearts are harder to fix." She smiled through watery eyes. "Can I still take it home?" "Of course you can." She wrapped her arms around my waist without warning. "Thank you." As we drove home, Daniel glanced at me. "She would have loved today." I looked out the window toward the endless fields. No, I think she did. Because kindness has a strange way of refusing to end where one life does. It keeps traveling, from one person to another, from one generation to the next, like seeds carried by the wind. Sometimes they bloom in places the gardener never gets to see. Every June, I still return to the vegetable garden before sunrise. I plant tomatoes first, always tomatoes. Then I hang one new silver compass on the porch, not for myself. For whichever child walks through that gate someday wondering whether they matter. I want them to see it before anyone says a single word. Because some lessons should never have to wait 9 summers. Everyone deserves to know from the very beginning that love is not a prize to be earned. It is the place where no one is ever asked to leave so someone else can belong. 10 years after I opened Aunt Margaret's letter, I found myself standing on the same porch where my father had once driven away without looking back. Only this time, I wasn't watching someone leave. I was waiting for someone to arrive. A small blue car pulled into the driveway. Emma stepped out first. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She had become a teacher. Behind her came 12 nervous children carrying backpacks almost as big as they were. She smiled. "I hope you don't mind." I told them about the farmhouse, about the garden, about the woman who believed every child deserved to feel seen. I looked at the children. Some smiled. Some avoided eye contact. One little boy stood apart from everyone else. I recognized that look immediately, the careful silence, the habit of making yourself smaller, the hope that nobody would notice you because disappointment hurts less when it comes quietly. I had worn that expression for years. "Welcome, everyone," I said. This week there's only one rule. Nobody gets left out. The children spent the afternoon planting vegetables. They painted old flower pots. They chased butterflies through the field behind the barn. At dinner, I noticed the quiet little boy sitting alone at the end of the table. I carried my plate over and sat beside him. "What's your favorite food?" he shrugged. "Nobody ever asks me that." My heart tightened. "Well, I'm asking now." After a long pause, he smiled. "Mashed potatoes." The next evening, we made mashed potatoes together. By the end of the week, he was laughing louder than anyone else. When the bus came to take the children home, he handed me a folded piece of paper. I waited until they had driven away before opening it. It was a drawing, the farmhouse, the garden, the porch swing, and every single person was holding hands. Across the top he had written in uneven handwriting, "Nobody gets left out." I framed that drawing. It hangs beside Aunt Margaret's compass. Visitors often ask why a child's picture has such an important place in the house. I simply smile, because sometimes a child understands the ending of a story better than any adult ever could. People still ask me whether I forgave my parents. The answer has never been simple. Forgiveness wasn't a door I walked through one afternoon. It was a path. Some days were easy, some days weren't. But forgiveness was never about pretending those 9 summers didn't happen. It was about refusing to let those summers decide every season that came afterward. My father passed away peacefully several years later. During the reception after his funeral, a family friend told me something I had never heard before. "Your dad talked about you all the time." I looked surprised. He said you taught him that love isn't what we feel. It's what we choose to do. I smiled through tears. At least he had finally learned the lesson, even if it came later than either of us wanted. When people drive past the farmhouse now, they often notice a wooden sign near the front gate. It wasn't there when Aunt Margaret was alive. I carved it myself. It says only 7 words. There is always room for one more. Every summer, children run through that gate. Some belong to our family, some don't. By the end of the week, it no longer matters. Because the greatest inheritance Aunt Margaret left me wasn't the farmhouse. It wasn't the garden. It wasn't even the letters that finally uncovered the truth. It was the courage to become the kind of adult I had once desperately needed as a child. And every time another little voice laughs across that old porch, I know her legacy is still growing. Just like the tomatoes. Just like hope, just like love, the farmhouse became more than my home. It became a promise, not written on paper, not protected by lawyers, protected by the people who walked through its front gate. Every June, the guest room filled with children. Some stayed 3 days, some stayed 2 weeks. A few returned every single summer until they were old enough to bring children of their own. One afternoon, nearly 20 years after Aunt Margaret's passing, Emma arrived carrying a cardboard box. I found these in Mom's attic. Inside were dozens of old VHS tapes. The labels were simple. Summer 2004, Summer 2005, Summer 2006. My heart skipped. I had no idea these existed. Daniel frowned. Neither did I. We borrowed an old video player from a neighbor. The picture flickered. Static danced across the screen. Then Aunt Margaret appeared. She was standing in the vegetable garden. She laughed toward the camera. "Hold still, Evelyn. You're planting those tomatoes upside down again." A little girl burst into the frame. Me, 8 years old, covered in dirt, laughing so hard I nearly fell over. I couldn't remember that laugh, not until I heard it. The tape continued. There were no dramatic speeches, no hidden confessions, just ordinary days, making strawberry jam, painting the porch, building birdhouses, reading books during thunderstorms, watching fireflies after sunset. At one point, Aunt Margaret turned the camera toward herself. "If you're watching this someday, sweetheart, then you probably needed proof that you were happy here. Don't let anyone convince you those summers were only about what you missed. Remember what you gained too." The screen faded to black. Nobody in the room spoke. Daniel quietly wiped his eyes. Mom covered her mouth. Dad wasn't there to see it. Part of me wished he had been. Another part believed he already knew. We watched every tape over the next several evenings. Each summer looked different. I grew taller. My voice changed. The garden expanded. The porch received fresh paint. But one thing never changed. Every single year, before turning the camera off, Aunt Margaret looked directly into the lens and said the same sentence. "You are enough." Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she looked exhausted, sometimes she whispered it, but she never forgot. 9 summers, 9 recordings, the exact same words. When the final tape ended, Emma asked quietly, "Do you think she knew you'd need to hear it later?" I smiled through tears. I think she knew I needed to hear it then. She just hoped one day I'd finally believe it. A month later, we organized a community picnic at the farmhouse. Nearly 100 people came. Neighbors, former students, families, children who had once visited during the summers. Near sunset, I stood on the porch and looked across the yard. There were picnic blankets everywhere. Someone was playing guitar. Children were racing through the orchard. The garden overflowed with tomatoes. For a brief moment, I imagined Aunt Margaret sitting beside me on the old swing. She would have looked at the crowd. Then she would have smiled that quiet smile of hers. Not proud, simply peaceful. Because she had never cared about being remembered. She cared about kindness continuing after she was gone. As darkness settled over the fields, Emma walked onto the porch carrying the old silver compass. She placed it in my hand, still pointing north. I laughed softly. It always will. She looked across the yard. "What do you think your real inheritance was?" I looked at the children laughing beneath strings of warm lights, at Daniel helping wash dishes, at my mother teaching 2 little girls how to knead bread, at strangers who somehow no longer felt like strangers. Then I closed my fingers around the compass. Not the house, not the land, not the letters. Hope. Someone gave it to me when I had almost none left. Now it's my turn to pass it on. That night, after everyone had gone home, I locked the front door and turned off the porch light. The compass caught one last beam of moonlight before the house grew quiet. I smiled. Because I finally understood something that had taken me almost a lifetime to learn. The greatest revenge is not making the people who hurt you suffer. The greatest revenge is building such a beautiful life that their worst decision no longer has the power to define your best years. And every summer, when another child runs through that gate without wondering whether they belong, I know one simple truth. The cycle ended with me. And that is the happiest ending I could ever have written for my own life.